Hey, greetings and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us today for our forum on America's economic recovery, a topic that's very much on everyone's mind these days. And, a lot of people want to know whether it's real or not. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for supporting today's conversations. 20 months into the pandemic that's not over, the nation's economic revival is a study in contrast. Rising consumer prices, product shortages, and labor inconsistencies are rattling this recovery, while at the same time, more than 4 million jobs have been created this year alone. The stock market is setting new records and wages are rising. How are consumers navigating the new normal as we seek a return to economic health? What is the growth forecast for next year? And what does a sustained recovery really mean for big and small businesses? We have an exciting lineup of speakers joining me for these conversations, and we'll get to it in just a moment. But first, some housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag the Hill Econ Recovery. That's a lot. I just go with you do what I told you to. The Hill Econ Recovery. But staff, next time the Hill Econ might be better. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, if you have any trouble with the video, don't throw your TV through the roof or throw the computer through the window. Just push refresh the page and it will all be better. We begin with two powerhouse economists. How do they view the current economic landscape and the potential impact of the infrastructure bill and other legislative action coming down the pike? I'm delighted to be joined by Nela Richardson. Nela, it's great to see you again. Chief economist at ADP, a private payroll firm. Prior to that, she was chief economist at Redfin and has had stints at the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, Freddie Mac, and at Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. And we also have Janet Currie, the Henry Putnam Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's also the co-director of Princeton's Center for Health and Well-Being, and she also co-directs the program on families and children at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Welcome to you both. Nela, great to see you again. I've enjoyed our conversations in the past. Give us a snapshot. I mean, I think that what I just said about this economy being one of a lot of contradictions and contrasts is probably right, when you sort of look at some dimensions. I know you've done some studies. You see some elements coming back to normal, and yet you still see some abiding concerns. So give us a snapshot of how you see the economy going right now.
Well, the economy has always been incredibly uneven. What the pandemic has done is exacerbate the differences. And we see that in a jobs recovery that continues. It continues to speed along, but in an incredibly uneven way. And we also see an economy that has a lot of strength, but some of that strength has been based on an unprecedented amount of federal support. So we're now in this transition period where it looks like the Federal Reserve is going to be backing off some of that support in terms of financial conditions and making it easy and cheap to borrow. And also the government has kind of closed in the purse strings. Even though there's an infrastructure bill, these direct payments to households have ceased, expanded unemployment benefits to workers have ceased. So we still are in the recovery mode with less federal support than before. About 4 million people who were working before the pandemic are not working now. Had there been no pandemic, we would have expected another 2 million in the past 20 months to be added. So we're really 6 million in the hole. And it's a big hole to dig out of. The good news is that if the pandemic stays contained, we can expect some still jobs recovery to go forward, again, with a note to how uneven that progress will still be.
Nela, thank you. Before I jump to Janet, can you help me understand this math? So our unemployment is down to about 4.7%, right? Official. I know that there are other elements in that figure for discouraged workers and folks that are part-time employment, but the big number that people look at is 4.7%. You look at the so-called jobs gap, open jobs in the country, at really all different kinds of levels. It's a huge number. And I've just been asking myself, where could that number go to if we actually had, more holistic, if we had wages rise, if you had people, I just want to know how to square the job gap with this low unemployment figure. Can you help me to understand?
The unemployment rate is actually the least important rate right now. It's the participation rate that's more important. The unemployment rate is not telling you the story of the labor market. It's not telling you that there are still 4 million people sidelined by this thing. It's not telling you that a third of workers have been unemployed for 6 months or more, what we call long-term unemployed. It's not telling you about the bottlenecks to hiring that are pervasive through the system. And it's definitely not telling you about the pandemic-related barriers. And I know that my esteemed panelist, Janet, will talk about this, to working families when it comes to limited childcare and education services. So that rate is not telling you the story. No. What we have to do is really look at holistically what's going on. Yes, there's a lot of openings, job openings right now, and there's a lot of churn in the labor market. And what we're seeing is not only a jobs market recovery, but a structural transformation of the world of work at all. Every time you open a Zoom camera, you are experiencing a workplace transformation. And what that means in terms of an uneven economy, there are workers who are sidelined that are being left behind in that transformation.
Well, I really appreciate that clarification. And Janet, I just love that, get your snapshot on the economy, but also why aren't we taking participation rate or other data points that can be marketed, if you will, and talked about by the media that give a more real picture of the fact that this is not just a rosy situation, as oftentimes gets discussed, even from the Biden White House that's so proud of where the unemployment rate is. Your thoughts?
So I want to pick up on one of Nela's points, which is that this has sort of been a long time coming. So we're focusing on the current recession and what was caused by COVID, but there are underlying factors here which have been going on for a long time. So, one of those is the recession low wages and what was caused for people at the low end of the education distribution. And we've seen declining labor force participation over quite a long period of time. Especially for women. So in the post-war period, we had this huge increase in women in the labor force. It peaked in 1999. So that's a long time ago. That's more than 20 years ago, and it's been going down ever since. So, why aren't women participating in the labor market? Well, it's hard, right? It's hard to have a family, and it's hard to have a job, and we don't make it any easier for people. We don't subsidize childcare to the extent that other countries do. And people are always talking about Scandinavia versus the U.S., but let's look at a country like Chile. Chile spends $7,000 per toddler. We spend $500 per toddler, right? So we're not doing even as good a job as sort of a middle-income country like Chile in terms of supporting childcare. We don't have paid leave, as many people have pointed out. We're the only sort of wealthy industrial country that doesn't have any kind of uniform paid leave. And all these things make it difficult to be in the labor market. And then you add COVID and the schools shutting down. 20% of child care centers have closed. They're not reopening. The child care operators are facing higher wages for people, which were not very high to begin with, like $11 per hour. So, there's some structural factors here which have been operating for a long time, and now we're, really needing to look at them if we want to reverse these trends.
I really appreciate you kind of going to the infrastructure, because one of the things that's been haunting my mind, is I kind of come in this as a lay person and take a kind of quick snapshot look of, when you kind of look at that go-go economy that I sort of felt like we were feeling before COVID hit. And I used to tell people, you had a kind of high trust economy. You had just-in-time money, just-in-time jobs, just-in-time credit. And then there was this seizure, and the global supply chain kind of had a heart attack, and everybody. Right now it feels like the old Soviet Union, where it takes you 3 weeks to buy a washer and get in. And so it's a very different world. And what you just talked about the childcare infrastructure, and then how so many places have closed down. I mean, I organize a lot of parties to DC, just to be honest. And I have a lot of friends who can't come because there's just no available childcare support or babysitting support or other support that normally was there. And I'm like, what happened from that period before? And I think you just described it quite well. But look, that's talking about people who have jobs and others. I'd like to talk to Nela about the parts of the economy of people whose talent has been left on the table, who've been passed by, who are on the lower end of this, and whether or not, when you go through a pandemic like this and you see so much of it digitally, what are our opportunities to rewire that social contract so we can correct some of our problems from the past?
Beautiful question. I love the question, first of all, because I think that's the right question to be asking at this moment. We've focused so much on recovering these low-skill jobs. If you look at leisure and hospitality, before the pandemic, it was roughly 11% of employees, but it took 40% of the job losses. And then you look within the people who felt the brunt of this pain. It's mostly young people, low-skilled people, and older people, so our most vulnerable in the workforce. But there's a huge opportunity here that I'm afraid that might be missed, and that's the opportunity to reskill and retool for the jobs of tomorrow. That was always going to be needed. It was always necessary. These are not pandemic outbursts. These are the structural implications of a digital transformation. And now that consumers have become much more digitally savvy, and as businesses have transformed their operations, big and small businesses have innovated to stay afloat during this crisis too. It means that we have an ability now to train the workers of tomorrow if we invest in them. I'll also say one more statement for those who are working. Preferences have shifted dramatically. People are much more engaged in hybrid work, remote work. Companies are much more forward-looking in health and safety of their workers, because what we've all learned in this process is that a healthy workforce is necessary for the business community as well. It's not just a byproduct of private life. It's also an important part of public life as well.
Well, Janet and Nela, I want to ask Janet first and then Nela. I am so taken with what you just said about upskilling, reskilling, retraining. And I guess, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have believed in those words, that I would have heard them as, a kind of fig leaf over a trade deal or something, that they used to talk a lot about retraining workers. But essentially, you had generations of people forgotten and left behind, and people were focusing on youth and how do you rewire those folks. But I'm sort of interested in whether or not the opportunities to retrain, upskill, engage in continuous education for incumbent workers is a real thing now that we can be embracing and showing and paying for in some way or subsidizing. Janet, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that's got to be part of a healthy economy.
Yeah, I think, human capital is the most important part of infrastructure, and we need to invest in that human capital. One way to do that with some flexibility is by looking at community colleges, which already do a good job training people to do very specific things. And I'm thinking especially with respect to IT, there's a lot of certifications that people can get, which will be directly useful to them in the labor market. So expanding that sector of our educational system is one way to assist and pick up workers and help them get the skills that they need to really be successful in today's labor market.
Thank you. Nela, your thoughts on that?
Well, maybe that's the silver lining of labor shortages, that companies are much more incentivized to do this, that governments and local and national governments may be more incentivized to work with companies to really reskill, retrain. And also I'd overlay, part of this discussion was going on before in regards to immigration, and we've seen immigration slow down over the past 20 months. So some of the jobs that were filled by new arrivals, new immigrants, are not being filled now. And so those shortages are persistent. And so rethinking what the skills are needed by this country right now, and how companies and government agencies can partner to make sure that those skills, and academic institutions, community colleges, is a really important discussion to have.
Nela, you also tweeted out something I like, because I feel this, because I needed a plumber this week. And you wrote, says, actually, I think the world needs more plumbers. I agree.
Yeah.
And electricians and all specialty trades. Really, the housing market has been chronically undersupplied for the last decade. A key reason is not enough construction workers. Does some of the legislation that's coming down the pike on the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, does this begin to alleviate some of these pressures, or is that naive to think that we're going to have a magic wand come in and just create a bunch more workers? I have to tell you that, I think ever since the pandemic, anyone who's been trying to find, some folks to help someone who knows nothing about plumbing or any of that stuff, I've been desperate for folks, and it's been a bleak situation on that front. But do you think that the shifts that are going on now in terms of money going into some of these areas will change the game?
I think it is a long-term game changer. I don't think it's a short-term one. That's the promise of infrastructure, is that it pays off years into the future. And it's a good reminder of where we came from. The economy wasn't going gangbusters before the pandemic. It was a slow growth. It was a decade of tortoise-like growth. And at the end of that decade, we finally saw wages starting to break the ice for low-skilled jobs. So if we could pick up where we left off and then add this opportunity to enhance a skill set for skills that the economy desperately needs right now. And I think an infrastructure bill is great, but it creates a lot of demand for labor that we don't have right now. I think there is, again, a huge opportunity to train a workforce for the skills of today and tomorrow. And hopefully that's one of the outcomes.
Janet, what is your thought on what some of the bills coming down the pike might do to change the economic vector we've been on, and are they substantial enough?
Well, as Nela said, there is no magic wand, so there's nothing that you're going to do right immediately and immediately have a reaction that's going to make things a lot better. But over the longer term, some of the things that may or may not be coming down the pike in terms of maintaining the child tax credit, maintaining support for childcare and working families, those will allow people to go into the labor force and get the training that they need. I think that it's important to keep in mind that even that if you pass like this huge infrastructure bill right now, it's going to take a long time for all of the effects of that to be felt. So it's hard to judge what the success of something is. By the time the full effects are felt, people will have forgotten about all of the discussion and the promises that were made at the time.
Right, Janet, can you kind of explain?
Investment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you please also, Janet, explain to our audience this term that you've used, and I was talking to one of the early conceptualizers of it the other day, the she-cession.
Yeah, it's really interesting that people call it that, because if you compare it, for example, to the last big recession, like in 2006, 2009, the employment to population ratio fell by 6% for men and about 3% for women. So it was like 2/3 men, 1/3 women. This time around, it actually fell by about the same amount for men and women. But so relatively, it was felt more by women. But it's not like men didn't get laid off as well. Lots of men also lost their employment. So it's maybe a little bit of a misnomer to call it a she-cession. It's just that usually it's men that lose more when there's a downturn, and this time women suffered as well, because so many of them are employed in sectors like hospitality, services, which showed big declines.
Nela, another obsession of mine in doing this series, it's been supported by Wells Fargo, has been looking at small business. And sometimes I feel resistant to use the word small business because a lot of small businesses, see themselves as big businesses eventually, or they don't want to. But also small business is a frame that often means, kind of where your loan levels are and things of this very sort of what you qualify for. And we saw a lot of businesses excluded in the early support from the government after COVID. So what I've gotten really interested in are these micro ventures, these small, tiny, 1 or 2 person operations that are booming right now. There's a company called GoDaddy that is the biggest internet registrar in the country, and they funded a study done by Arizona State University and University of Iowa and UCLA Anderson School called Venture Forward. It's online, folks. It's Venture Forward. And you can get in and look at these remarkably interesting startups of micro ventures. The chairman of GoDaddy calls them sometimes side hustles that people have done to supplement. And when you look at the racial composition, the gender dimensions, you see a lot more balance out there than you do in, kind of the upper end of the business community. There's something going on with people willing to take risks. And I'm wondering at a company like ADP or something, and I ask legislators the same question, are those micro businesses which are generating revenue and those areas where there are a lot of them are more resilient against recession than those that are not, are they on anybody's radar screen? Have you had any time? I mean, does that make sense?
They certainly are on ADP's radar screen. We provide payroll services, yes, even to sole proprietorships. We provide all kinds of tax solutions. And so small businesses is ADP's bread and butter. Yes, we work with large firms, but we have a heart also and an arm also in the small business community. And I'll tell you what, it's part of this great transformation of the workforce that we talked about earlier. People have understood, and I think there's been a well-documented trend from the Fed that maybe 1.5 million to 2 million people more retired because of the pandemic. But like all these other trends, they were set in motion well before the pandemic. We knew that there was going to be a wave of boomer retirees. What's different, though, is that people now have this option with all this hybrid technology and virtual technology. We have this option on how to supply our work to the market. Many more options than we did 2 years ago even. And so we've seen a ramp up in the new business formations on an average for most of this year of 400,000 a year versus around 400,000 a month versus 250,000 a month before the pandemic. And people have this flexibility now to go into business for themselves and then offer their professional services to the employers. And I would say that if you're thinking of this as a white collar trend, talk to your plumbers because they are small business owners and have done quite well during this time and will continue given the dynamics of the workforce and the lack of people in skilled trades.
Well, thank you. Janet, I've got a question from the audience, posed to both of you, but you first, from Marjorie Parker, who's president and CEO of Jobs First NYC. And she says, how are young adults 18 to 24 recovering, and what are the challenges ahead for young workers, and how is the virtual economy continuing to grow? Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot of research showing that the job market conditions when you enter the labor force have really long-term effects on people. So, if you come into the labor force during a recession, you don't get a good job, then you have, less of a leg up than if you had started better. And that tends to have effects on your earnings that are very persistent over time. So we should worry about the generation that entered in the face of, all of this disruption. Now, people are very resilient, and you were asking about micro enterprises and the self-employed. But a lot of times that is a side hustle, and people would really rather be doing something else, and they're doing that, to keep the wolf from the door. Today, the Wall Street Journal had an article that showed that about a quarter of people who are self-employed were having trouble making ends meet. So it's certainly not necessarily a great thing to see so many people in those, in those occupations.
That's terrific. And just finally, just to end this out, Nela, I remember the 2008-2009 recession, you began to see people talking about gig work and, gig workers. And there was this sort of romantic charm to it, that people had greater flexibility. They could go drive when they wanted and come in. But I interviewed somebody the other day at the Web Summit in Lisbon. And, she made a strong case that what we've seen is the continuing hollowing out of benefits and support for, these workers and what she calls precarious work. But a kind of abroad the board slimming down, if you will, of the various benefits around there that we've kind of found that the Ubers and Lyfts and others have found a way to kind of make prettier than it really is. And I found it to be very compelling, and I that was caused by another recession. Are we going to be looking at, as we come out of the COVID recession, or I wouldn't call it the COVID experience, that we're going to be seeing again, an attack on benefits people have, the health care, portability of pensions, et cetera? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we should make a distinction between gig workers, especially young gig workers and professionals later in their career who are opening up and contributing to the workforce in a different way. I do think that we need to be very concerned across the board, young and middle and everything in between and old, about workplace benefits and health benefits and those infrastructures that allow the workplace to continue on. We saw how important health benefits were throughout this pandemic. And so to see any erosion in those benefits is a little, if you're a company who is desiring of labor, you really want to have access to a healthy workforce. And so I would expect somewhat of the opposite. I would expect that there would be more attention placed on the health of workers in the workplace and the mental health of workers. In terms of gig workers, though, we did a survey earlier in the year at the ADP Research Institute, and we've seen much less appetite for gig work, I think, for the very reasons that you cite. So workers are having a moment post-pandemic with all of these labor shortages and job openings. And I think this is a place where you're going to see worker preferences actually move the needle. And it's been a long time since workers have been able to assert en masse what the conditions that they need to make a workplace better. But that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Well, listen, there's been a great discussion. I could go on all day because I'm sort of I think a nerd desperate to understand these different trends going on. But I want to thank Nela Richardson, Chief Economist of ADP, Janet Currie, Henry Putnam, Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Come back and talk to me and keep me smart on this stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be here.